Welcome. Today we are going to talk about the story of the Good Samaritan and how Marcus Mescher develops a theology of neighbor out of this story in Chapter 2 of the Ethics of Encounter. If you aren't familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, you'll want to read it first. You can find it in the Gospel of Luke, Chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. In order to apply the story of the Good Samaritan to our lives today through a theology of neighbor, we first need to really understand the story and what it would have meant to the original listeners of the story when Jesus told it. First, a wrong path to go down. You might be familiar with Good Samaritan laws. These are laws that protect people when they are trying to do something good. One example is that many states have laws to protect people who perform CPR on someone. This protection only applies to those who are not being paid for their services. We have these laws because performing emergency CPR as a non-professional in order to save someone's life, even if you accidentally break one of their ribs, is a great act. But it's something few of us will ever do. Consequently, Mescher tells us to bracket that understanding of a Good Samaritan and instead think about the Good Samaritan in terms of actions you can perform every day. The story ends with "go and do likewise," and Mescher takes that to mean the lessons of the story should be widely applicable daily occurrences, not rare heroic acts. So what do we need to know to get the right idea about this story? First, we should set the scene. The road between Jericho and Jerusalem is steep. So steep, in fact, that it was made to zigzag to slow down the rate of change in elevation. If you've ever been downhill skiing, you know what I'm talking about. Beginners on a steep mountain are taught to zigzag back and forth in order to slow their descent. Since the road zigzagged, it was dangerous. The many twists and turns offered many hiding places for robbers, and the road was well known to be dangerous. Listeners may be thinking the beaten man got what he had coming, traveling on a dangerous road all alone. The Samaritan stopping may not have been so much good as foolish. He's putting himself in harm's way as well. The story centers on the question, who is my neighbor? So we need to know how Jesus' original Jewish listeners would have heard that question. Mescher explains that they would have had a clear idea about who counts as a neighbor, and they might have illustrated it with concentric circles. In the middle is neighbors. This is your in-group, other Jews. You have a special obligation to take care of these people if they travel through your town. And then we have a larger circle of non-neighbors. Jews knew they should take care of these people too, especially if they were in great need. But they didn't carry the same obligation as neighbors. Lastly, you had enemies. You're not obligated to care for this group. In our story, a Jew is injured, and both the priest and the Levite should have considered him a neighbor. They were obligated to stop, but they didn't. The Samaritan who did stop was an enemy. He was not obligated to stop, but he did anyway because he thought less about whether the beaten man obligated him to stop and more about his own duty to act as a neighbor regardless of who the other person was. And that's the point of the story. Stop asking who your neighbor is. Start asking how you can be a neighbor. Have you ever heard a good explanation for why the Jews and Samaritans were enemies? This question is key if we want to understand why the story of the Good Samaritan is framed by a discussion of eternal life. It's a complicated history, but this is a simplified version. In the area now known as Israel, we have two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, also known as Judea. The northern kingdom gets conquered by Assyrians in 722 BCE. That's hundreds of years before Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Assyrians were skilled at conquering, and they had a strategy. Whenever they conquered a new land, they would expel many of the citizens and import a bunch of foreigners from other lands they had previously conquered. The result was that everyone was mixed up. This destroys the kind of alliances and underground trust that might have otherwise led to a mutiny. When people don't know each other or trust each other, they are easier to control. At this point, our story goes in two directions, the Jewish version and the Samaritan version. The Jewish version of events tells us that the Samaritans were mostly foreigners that were brought in by the Assyrians. They encountered the Jewish faith and the Torah, the Jewish sacred scriptures, but they blended it with their own practices. Most notably, they write the 10 Commandments differently, including a commandment to worship in the temple on Mount Gerizim. The Jews, who worship at the temple in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom, saw this as idolatry, worshiping the wrong God at the wrong temple. Consequently, the Samaritans were not considered part of the covenantal relationship with God and would not inherit eternal life. The Samaritans tell it differently. They say they were the original inhabitants of the northern kingdom. The Jews to the south were the people expelled by the Assyrians. They are the ones who introduced errors into the Torah and changed practices. For example, worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans believe their version of the Torah is the original version. Whose history is right? It's impossible to know for sure. Both versions of the Torah are really old. And the people are all genetically similar. We can't really tell who was original. What happened to the Samaritans? Well, they still exist, although there are only a few hundred of them left. Their dress and practices look very similar to what you'd find in Judaism. They still worship on Mount Gerizim, although the temple there was destroyed, much like the temple in Jerusalem was. With all this in mind, we can turn to the 5 points of Mescher's Theology of Neighbor. First, love of neighbor knows no bounds. The concentric circles are no more. The limits have been removed. Second, it is always and everywhere our duty to act as a neighbor. This is the flip side of number 1. Since the limits have been removed, we should always act as a neighbor. Remember, this is not a one-time heroic act. Third, we should act with the virtues of courage, mercy, generosity, humility, and fidelity. We can see these 5 virtues in the actions of the Samaritan. He shows courage because the road was dangerous. He shows mercy by stopping to help the beaten man. He shows generosity by paying for his care. He shows humility by recognizing the limits of what he can do. He cannot wait for the man to get better, nor can he prevent future acts of injustice on the road. Lastly, he shows fidelity in his commitment to live out his faith and act in solidarity with those he encounters. The 4th element of this theology of neighbor is rightly ordered love. Even if we are called to always act as a neighbor, we still have some decisions to make. How will we prioritize the poor? Do we have an additional obligation to our friends and family? Is it possible to love everyone? These can be tough questions to answer. Lastly, we need to be open to radical possibilities. This doesn't mean the impossible, but it means everything is back on the table. Maybe everyone can belong.